The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light filtering through the cracked windows of Murphy's garage, and I could feel the weight of 53 years pressing down on my shoulders as I stared at the auction notice taped to my workbench. My name is Frank Castellano, and for 3 decades I'd been the man this town turned to when their engines died and their transmissions gave up the ghost. The smell of motor oil and metal shavings had become as familiar to me as my own breathing, seeping into my clothes, my skin, my very identity, until I couldn't imagine myself as anything other than the guy who could fix what was broken and make it run again. My calloused hands had coaxed life back into everything from rusted farm trucks to pristine Sunday drivers, but now I was looking at a piece of paper that would change everything I thought I knew about legacy, honor, and the debts we carry for the dead. The notice was simple enough: Harold Brennan's estate auction, scheduled for the following Saturday, with a special notation that certain properties had already been distributed according to his will. My name appeared on a short list of beneficiaries, which struck me as impossible since I barely knew the old man beyond his twice-yearly visits to my shop. Rex, my 8-year-old German shepherd, lifted his grizzled muzzle from where he'd been dozing beside my toolbox, those intelligent brown eyes studying my face with the kind of patience that only comes from years of shared silence. His coat had started showing gray around the ears and muzzle, mirror images of the silver that had crept into my own hair since Sarah passed. He'd been with me since he was a pup, back when my Sarah was still alive and our grandson Tommy was just learning to walk, back when the future seemed predictable and loss was something that happened to other people. I remembered the day we'd brought Rex home, how Sarah had insisted we needed something young and full of life in the house after our son Michael had moved to Denver with his new job. She'd been right, as usual. Rex had filled spaces I hadn't even realized were empty, becoming not just a pet but a constant companion who understood the rhythm of my work, the weight of my silences, and the particular way grief could settle into a man's bones and stay there. Now Sarah's been gone 2 years, Tommy's off at college studying engineering, and Rex and I have settled into the quiet rhythm of two old souls who understand each other without need for words. When I read aloud that Harold Brennan had left me his airplane hangar in his will, Rex's ears perked forward, and I swear I saw something like concern flash across his expression. The hangar wasn't something anyone in town talked about much. It sat on the outskirts of our small Nebraska community like a relic from another era, a massive concrete and steel structure that most people assumed was empty or filled with junk. Harold himself was something of a mystery, a man who'd lived alone in a small house near the grain elevator, driving ancient pickup trucks and keeping to himself except for occasional appearances at the hardware store or the diner. The morning after receiving the notice, I drove over to Mel's diner for my usual breakfast, hoping the familiar routine might help me process this unexpected development. The coffee was bitter, the way I'd grown to prefer it after Sarah's death, and the eggs were exactly as I'd ordered them, over easy with wheat toast, no butter. But the conversation at the table behind me cut through my concentration like a hacksaw through aluminum. Jake Simmons and his crew were having themselves a fine time discussing my inheritance, their voices loud enough to ensure I heard every word of their commentary. "Frank's gonna learn real quick that Harold was broke as a church mouse," Jake was saying between gulps of coffee, loud enough to make sure I caught every word. "That hangar's been empty for 20 years, probably costs more in taxes than it's worth. Old Harold probably figured he'd saddle someone else with his problems instead of letting the county take it." The laughter that followed felt like sandpaper against my pride, but I kept my mouth shut and finished my eggs, the food turning to sawdust in my mouth as I listened to men who'd never built anything in their lives dismiss a legacy they couldn't begin to understand. Rex, who'd been lying at my feet with the patience that comes from years of accompanying me to public places, stood up slowly and fixed Jake with a stare that could have melted steel. Sometimes I think that dog reads people better than I do, sees through their words to whatever's festering underneath, cuts right to the core of what makes someone need to tear down others to feel better about themselves. Jake's laughter died in his throat under that steady gaze, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the loyalty of a creature who'd never learned to doubt or second-guess the bonds that matter. The drive home gave me time to think about what I knew of Harold Brennan, which wasn't much beyond the surface details everyone in town was familiar with. He'd served in Korea, that much was common knowledge, though he never talked about it the way some veterans did. He'd worked for the railroad after the war, something in maintenance or inspection, a job that had kept him traveling until his retirement 15 years ago. His house was neat but sparse, his truck was always clean despite its age, and he had a way of looking at people that suggested he was measuring them against standards they probably couldn't meet. Walking out to the hangar that first time, I felt like I was trespassing on hallowed ground. The building sat on 12 acres of scrubland about 5 miles outside town, accessible by a gravel road that wound through stands of cottonwood and prairie grass that had grown wild in the absence of regular maintenance. The structure itself was imposing, easily 100 feet long and 70 feet wide, with steel beams and concrete walls that looked like they'd been built to withstand everything from tornadoes to direct artillery hits. This wasn't some prefabricated agricultural building. This was serious construction, the kind that required permits and planning and significant investment. The padlock on the main door was newer than I'd expected, and when I turned Harold's key, the heavy metal groaned like it was waking from a long sleep. The sound echoed in the vast space beyond, creating harmonics that spoke of emptiness and potential in equal measure. Rex pushed past me into the darkness, his nose working overtime as he disappeared into the shadows, following scents I couldn't detect but trusting his instincts the way I'd learned to trust my hands when they told me something was wrong with an engine before any diagnostic equipment could confirm the problem. The smell hit me immediately: aviation fuel, old leather, and something else I couldn't quite place, something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my skin crawl with the kind of premonition that comes from walking into situations that are more complicated than they appear. The odor of aviation fuel was particularly strong, which seemed odd for a building that supposedly hadn't housed aircraft in decades. Either Harold had been storing fuel illegally, which seemed out of character, or there were aircraft in here that nobody knew about, which seemed impossible in a community where everyone knew everything about everyone else's business. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through skylights thick with decades of dust and debris, I began to make out shapes that confirmed my suspicions. The hangar was far from empty. 3 aircraft sat covered by military surplus tarps, their shapes ghostly in the half-light, like sleeping giants waiting for someone to wake them from their long slumber. The tarps themselves were secured with bungee cords and rope, suggesting they'd been in place for years, possibly decades, protecting whatever lay beneath from dust, moisture, and prying eyes. But it was the workbenches along the walls that caught my attention and held it, covered with tools that looked like they'd been organized by someone who understood precision, who respected machinery the way I did, who approached every task with the methodical care that separates professionals from amateurs. These weren't the random collection of implements you'd expect in an abandoned building. They were carefully curated, properly maintained, arranged with the kind of systematic approach that comes from military training applied to civilian pursuits. Rex had stopped near the far corner, his body tense, tail straight out behind him like a pointer who'd caught scent of game. His posture radiated alertness and focus, the way he looked when he detected something that required investigation but wasn't sure whether it represented threat or opportunity. When I followed his gaze, I saw the outline of what looked like an office built into the back wall, its single window dark as a closed eye, its door closed and possibly locked. The office addition looked newer than the hangar itself, suggesting Harold had added it later, creating a private space within the larger structure. That night I lay awake thinking about Harold, trying to piece together the fragments I knew about his life from 30 years of casual acquaintance and community gossip. Sarah had always been better at reading people than I was, better at sensing the stories that lay beneath the surface presentations people offered to the world. She'd been the one who'd insisted on inviting Harold to Christmas dinner that one year when we'd heard he'd be spending the holiday alone, and though he'd politely declined, she'd sent me over with a plate of food and strict instructions not to take no for an answer. He'd been grateful for the gesture in a way that suggested he wasn't accustomed to such kindness. And we'd ended up talking for nearly 2 hours about everything except the war and his work. He'd asked about my business, about Tommy's progress in school, about Sarah's garden and whether the late frost had damaged her tomatoes. He noticed things: the new addition I'd built onto the garage, the restored chevelle in the side yard, the precision with which I'd organized my tools. Looking back, I realized he'd been evaluating me, measuring my character against criteria I couldn't have guessed at the time. Sarah used to say he had kind eyes but sad ones, like a man carrying weight that wasn't entirely his own. She'd been good at reading people, better than me, and now I wished I could ask her what she thought about this inheritance, what she might have seen in Harold that I'd missed during our infrequent interactions. She'd had a way of seeing past the surface of people to their essential nature, of understanding motivations and fears that remained invisible to everyone else. If she were here now, she'd probably have insights about Harold's decision that would make perfect sense once she explained them. Rex slept on the floor beside my bed, but I could tell from his breathing that he wasn't really sleeping either, just waiting. He'd been restless since our visit to the hangar, more alert than usual, spending time staring out windows as if expecting visitors who might not be entirely welcome. Dogs have senses we've lost or never possessed, abilities to detect changes in routine, shifts in atmosphere, approaching trouble that hasn't yet announced itself. His behavior suggested that inheriting Harold's hangar was going to complicate my life in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The questions started coming the next day, beginning with a phone call that interrupted my morning coffee and continued throughout the week with the persistence of flies around roadkill. Vernon Walsh from the bank called asking about my plans for the property, his voice carrying that particular tone bankers use when they smell opportunity mixed with potential complications. He wanted to know if I'd had the property appraised, if I understood the tax implications of the inheritance, if I might be interested in discussing financing options for development or subdivision. My neighbor Pete mentioned he'd always thought that land would make a good subdivision, what with the town growing and young families looking for places to build. Wasn't it lucky that Harold had thought of me, he said, though his tone suggested he was fishing for information about my intentions rather than celebrating my good fortune. Pete had been eyeing that property for years, I realized, probably hoping it would come on the market eventually, so he could expand his own holdings or broker a deal that would benefit his real estate connections in the county seat. Even my own daughter called from Phoenix, wanting to know if I was planning to sell, if maybe this windfall could help with my retirement planning or Tommy's college expenses. Linda meant well, but her questions carried the assumption that I'd want to convert this inheritance into cash as quickly as possible, that I'd view Harold's bequest as a financial opportunity rather than a responsibility or trust. Her practical nature, so much like her mother's in most respects, seemed blind to the possibility that some gifts come with obligations that transcend their monetary value. But every time someone suggested I cash in, I thought about Harold's steady eyes and the careful way he'd maintained those tools, the systematic organization that spoke of purpose and discipline, and something inside me rebelled against the idea. This wasn't random good fortune or an accidental windfall. Harold had chosen me specifically, deliberately, for reasons I didn't yet understand but felt compelled to discover. Walking away from that choice, converting his trust into dollars and cents, felt like betrayal before I even knew what I'd be betraying. Rex had taken to accompanying me on every visit to the hangar, and I noticed how he'd grown more confident in the space, like he was mapping out territories and establishing routines. He'd found a spot near the covered aircraft where the afternoon sun created a warm patch on the concrete floor, and he'd lie there watching me explore while staying alert to sounds from outside, vehicles on the gravel road, wind patterns that might indicate weather changes, the particular silence that settles over empty places when they're not quite as empty as they appear. During my third visit, I began examining the covered aircraft more closely, starting with the smallest shape positioned near the hangar's east wall. When I pulled back the tarp, I found myself looking at a pristine Piper Cub, yellow fabric stretched tight over its frame, propeller polished to mirror brightness, every surface maintained with the kind of attention that comes from genuine love of machinery. The aircraft looked like it could be sent arted and flown immediately, which raised immediate questions about Harold's activities during his supposed retirement. The second aircraft was larger, more complex, a Cessna 180 with modifications I didn't immediately recognize, additional fuel tanks and navigation equipment that suggested it had been configured for long-distance flights. Like the Piper, it showed evidence of meticulous maintenance, recent inspections, and regular operation despite its location in what everyone assumed was an abandoned building. Harold hadn't just been storing these aircraft, he'd been flying them, using them for purposes that required secrecy and precision. The third aircraft remained covered, but its shape suggested something military in origin, possibly World War II vintage based on the wing configuration and overall proportions. This discovery elevated my unease to genuine concern. Military aircraft required special permits, documentation, and oversight that Harold couldn't have managed without attracting attention from federal authorities. Either he'd been operating outside legal boundaries, or his background was more complex than anyone in town had realized. It was Rex who first drew my attention to the irregularities in the office floor, scratching at a section of concrete that didn't quite match the rest, whining in that low way he did when something wasn't right with the natural order of things. The concrete patch was roughly 4 feet square, newer than the surrounding floor, colored slightly different despite obvious attempts to match the original surface. When I knelt down and examined it more closely, I could see tool marks around the edges, evidence that someone had cut through the original concrete and poured a replacement section. The sledgehammer felt good in my hands, solid and honest in a way that reminded me why I'd always preferred working with tools over working with people. Tools were predictable. They responded to force and technique in ways you could calculate and control. People were messy, complicated, prone to deception and self-interest that made them unreliable partners in any endeavor that required trust. But tools would do exactly what you asked them to do, nothing more and nothing less, as long as you understood their capabilities and limitations. The concrete cracked on the third swing, revealing a metal box underneath that looked like it had been designed to survive atomic war. The container was military surplus, the kind of ammunition box that had been repurposed for storage of sensitive documents or valuable items that needed protection from moisture, fire, and unauthorized access. It was heavy enough to require both hands to lift, secured with a padlock that matched the one Harold had used on the hangar's main door, suggesting this cache had been his primary reason for choosing me as his heir. Rex's excitement was palpable as I pried it open, his tail beating against my leg as if he understood we were on the verge of something important, something that would redefine everything we thought we knew about the quiet man who'd entrusted us with his secrets. Inside, wrapped in old cloth that smelled of preservatives and careful planning, were documents that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about Harold Brennan and why he'd chosen to trust me with his final secret. The first thing I found was Harold's real military record, not the simple Korea veteran story everyone in town knew, but something much more complex and classified. Harold Brennan hadn't just served in Korea, he'd been part of something called the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, involved in operations that came with security clearances and non-disclosure agreements that apparently extended beyond death. His actual service record included commendations for reconnaissance work, intelligence gathering, and what the documents euphemistically described as special operations in support of national security interests. After Korea, Harold had been recruited into a joint military-civilian task force responsible for tracking and recovering stolen military equipment, particularly aircraft that had disappeared from surplus sales and transfer operations during the massive demobilization following World War II. Thousands of planes had been declared surplus and sold to private buyers, but a significant number had been diverted into black market channels, sold without proper documentation to collectors who asked no questions and paid premium prices for historical aircraft with questionable provenance. But it was the second set of documents that made my hands shake and my mouth go dry, detailed records of a missing aircraft, a P-51 Mustang that had disappeared during a transfer flight in 1953, along with photographs, correspondence, and evidence that suggested Harold had been tracking this particular plane for more than 60 years. The Mustang wasn't just missing, it was stolen, part of a sophisticated black market operation. And that had been selling military surplus to private collectors with no questions asked and no papers to prove legitimate ownership. The documentation was meticulous, the kind of careful record-keeping that comes from years of military discipline applied to civilian detective work. Harold had traced the stolen Mustang through 3 different owners, documented its modifications and alterations, photographed serial numbers and identifying marks, compiled maintenance records and flight logs, and somehow acquired proof that the current owner, a wealthy collector named Richard Thornton who lived in the state capital, had knowingly purchased stolen government property. But Harold had never acted on this information, had spent decades gathering evidence without seeking justice or restitution, building an airtight case while the statute of limitations expired and the original crime faded into historical footnote. The covering letter, written in Harold's careful hand and dated just 3 months before his death, explained his reasoning and his choice of me as his successor in this long-delayed pursuit of justice. Reading Harold's letter felt like receiving orders from beyond the grave, and Rex seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, sitting at attention beside me as if he too had been enlisted in this mission. Harold wrote about duty extending beyond death, about truths that needed telling even when the men who lived them were gone, about choosing me not because I was a mechanic, but because I was a man who honored my commitments and finished what I started. He'd been watching me for years, evaluating my character through our brief interactions, determining whether I had the integrity and persistence necessary to complete his life's work. The letter explained that the covered military aircraft in the hangar was itself part of the evidence, a restored P-40 Warhawk that Harold had purchased legally and documented thoroughly to demonstrate the difference between legitimate ownership and criminal acquisition. Every modification, every replacement part, every maintenance record had been preserved to show how honest collectors operated versus those who dealt in stolen property. The P-40 was both bait and proof, a comparison standard that would highlight the suspicious gaps in the Mustang's documentation. Harold had also included detailed instructions for contacting appropriate authorities, including the names of federal agents who'd worked similar cases, attorneys who specialized in military surplus fraud, and museum curators who could verify the historical significance of recovered aircraft. He'd thought of everything except the one thing he couldn't control, his own mortality, and the need to trust someone else with the culmination of his life's mission. The weight of that trust settled on my shoulders like a familiar tool, something I knew how to carry even if I didn't fully understand where it would take me. Rex sensed the change in my posture and pressed closer, offering the wordless support that had sustained me through Sarah's illness and death, through the adjustment to life as a widower, through all the small daily challenges that accumulate like dust in the corners of a man's existence. With him beside me, I felt capable of honoring Harold's faith in my character. The next morning I drove to the state police barracks, Harold's documentation secured in a briefcase on the passenger seat, and Rex riding shotgun like we were heading into battle. The 40-mile drive gave me time to rehearse my story, to anticipate the skepticism I'd encounter when I tried to explain how a small-town mechanic had inherited evidence of a 60-year-old crime from a man who'd apparently been conducting unauthorized investigations into military surplus fraud. Sergeant Maria Santos listened to my story with the kind of professional skepticism I'd expected, her expression shifting from polite attention to sharp interest as I laid out Harold's documentation piece by piece. She was younger than I'd anticipated, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of direct gaze that comes from years of separating truth from fabrication in situations where people's freedom depends on the accuracy of their statements. When she saw the quality of Harold's evidence, her attitude shifted from doubt to intense concentration. The stolen aircraft case had never been officially closed, she told me, just buried under decades of other priorities and bureaucratic shuffling. Cold cases involving property crimes from the 1950s rarely received active investigation unless new evidence surfaced or political pressure demanded action. Harold's documentation was exactly what they'd need to reopen the investigation and possibly recover not just the Mustang, but other stolen military aircraft that had disappeared into the same black market network. Sergeant Santos made several phone calls while I waited, contacting federal agencies that had jurisdiction of military property theft and consulting with attorneys who could advise on the legal complexities of recovering stolen aircraft after decades of apparent legitimate ownership. The conversations were conducted in the kind of bureaucratic shorthand that excluded civilians, but I caught enough fragments to understand that Harold's case was being taken seriously at levels far above local law enforcement. Within 2 days, federal agents had contacted me directly, requesting access to Harold's complete files and permission to examine the aircraft in his hangar. Agent Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the banker, she assured me with a slight smile that suggested she'd encountered this confusion before, represented something called the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, an agency I'd never heard of but which apparently specialized in exactly the kind of case Harold had developed. Agent Walsh was everything I'd expected from federal law enforcement, professional, thorough, intimidating in a way that came from authority rather than aggression. She examined Harold's documentation with the expertise of someone who'd seen similar cases, asking questions that demonstrated her familiarity with military surplus fraud and the specific challenges of prosecuting crimes involving historical aircraft. Rex took an immediate liking to her, which I considered a positive sign given his usually cautious approach to strangers. The examination of Harold's hangar took most of a day, with Agent Walsh and her team photographing everything, documenting serial numbers, and comparing Harold's records with federal databases of stolen military property. The P-40 Warhawk was indeed legally owned and properly documented, providing the contrast Harold had intended between legitimate acquisition and criminal purchase. The other aircraft had similarly clear provenance, suggesting Harold had been scrupulously careful to avoid any appearance of hypocrisy in his collection. But it was Harold's investigation of the stolen Mustang that impressed Agent Walsh the most. His documentation was more thorough than anything her agency had compiled on similar cases, demonstrating not just the theft of the original aircraft but the entire network of dealers, forgers, and collectors who'd enabled its illegal sale and resale over 6 decades. Harold had essentially done the federal government's job for them, building a prosecutable case while working alone and without official resources. The confrontation with Richard Thornton happened faster than I'd anticipated. Within a week, federal agents had obtained search warrants and descended on his private airfield with the kind of precision that suggested this operation had tentacles reaching far beyond one stolen Mustang. Thornton's collection included dozens of military aircraft, many with documentation that couldn't withstand scrutiny from investigators who knew what to look for and had access to military databases of stolen property. Agent Walsh invited me to observe the search from a distance, partly as a courtesy to Harold's memory, and partly because my mechanical expertise might be useful in identifying modifications or alterations that could indicate criminal activity. Watching federal agents swarm over Thornton's collection was surreal. Aircraft I'd seen featured in magazines and aviation websites were being tagged as evidence, their gleaming exteriors hiding decades of criminal ownership. Thornton himself was everything I'd expected from Harold's description: wealthy, arrogant, accustomed to using money and influence to avoid consequences for his actions. He arrived at his airfield in a Mercedes sedan, accompanied by attorneys who immediately began challenging the search warrants and demanding explanations for what they characterized as harassment of a legitimate collector. But their bluster faded when Agent Walsh showed them Harold's documentation and explained the federal charges their client was facing. The stolen Mustang was exactly where Harold's investigation had indicated it would be, hangared in a climate-controlled building and maintained in pristine condition by mechanics who'd probably never suspected they were servicing stolen property. When they rolled it into the sunlight for examination, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with honoring Harold's patient, methodical pursuit of truth. Thornton tried to claim ignorance, tried to produce forged documents and fake provenance papers, but Harold's evidence was too comprehensive, too carefully compiled to be dismissed or explained away. The serial numbers matched federal records, the modifications were consistent with post-theft alterations, and the chain of ownership included dealers who'd been suspected of similar crimes in other cases. When they arrested him, I felt a satisfaction that transcended personal vindication and touched something deeper about the nature of truth and accountability. The town's reaction split along predictable lines, dividing people who'd thought they knew Harold Brennan from those who'd sensed there was more to him than met the eye. Some people, mostly the ones who'd made jokes about Harold's worthless hangar, grew quiet and uncomfortable when they realized they'd been mocking a man who dedicated his retirement to serving his country in ways they couldn't comprehend. Their embarrassment was palpable, their previous certainty replaced by the kind of shame that comes from discovering your assumptions were not just wrong but profoundly unfair. Others, the ones who'd known Harold best, nodded as if this revelation explained things they'd sensed but never understood about his quiet intensity and his careful way of watching the world. Mrs. Peterson from the post office mentioned that Harold had received mail from government agencies throughout his retirement, correspondence he'd handled with the kind of discretion that suggested official business. Tom Bradley from the hardware store recalled that Harold had always paid for purchases with cash, never writing checks or using credit cards that might create paper trails. My daughter called from Phoenix to apologize for pushing me to sell the property, admitting she'd underestimated both Harold's bequest and my judgment in accepting it. Linda had always been practical to a fault, quick to reduce complex situations to financial calculations and risk assessments, but this situation had taught her something about value that couldn't be measured in dollars. For the first time since Sarah's death, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The recovered Mustang now sits in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, properly documented and displayed with a placard that mentions Harold Brennan's decades-long investigation into military aircraft theft. Visitors can read about his patient detective work, his commitment to recovering stolen military property, and his decision to entrust the completion of his mission to a small-town mechanic who'd proven worthy of that trust. The placard doesn't mention the years of ridicule Harold endured, the assumptions people made about his empty hangar, or the quiet dignity with which he'd carried his secrets. The reward money from the federal government was substantial enough to secure my retirement and ensure the hangar could be maintained as the workshop Harold had always intended it to be. But more than the money, more than the vindication or the recognition, was the knowledge that I'd been worthy of Harold's trust, that when called upon to finish a job that mattered, I'd seen it through to completion. The financial security was welcome, but the sense of purpose was invaluable. Agent Walsh stayed in touch after the case was closed, occasionally calling to update me on related investigations that had grown out of Harold's documentation. The network of stolen military aircraft was larger than anyone had suspected, involving collectors, dealers, and forgers across multiple states and spanning several decades. Harold's meticulous records had provided the key to unraveling the entire operation, leading to dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars worth of stolen military property. Rex has claimed permanent ownership of that warm spot on the hangar floor, and I've taken to spending my afternoons there, maintaining the aircraft Harold left behind and thinking about the difference between the legacies we plan and the ones we actually leave. The P-40 Warhawk requires regular maintenance to keep it airworthy, and I've discovered that working on aircraft engines isn't so different from working on automotive engines. They're both machines that respond to careful attention and skilled hands. The townspeople who laughed at my worthless inheritance now drive by slowly, sometimes stopping to ask questions about Harold's real story, about what it means to carry someone else's mission forward when they can no longer carry it themselves. I tell them what I've learned, that honor doesn't always announce itself, that some of the most important work gets done in shadows and silence, and that the measure of a man isn't in what he accumulates, but in what he protects and preserves for those who come after. Young people from the high school sometimes visit, drawn by stories of Harold's investigation and interested in learning about aviation history and military aircraft. I've started giving an informal tour of the hangar, explaining how Harold's careful documentation had made the difference between a cold case and successful prosecution, how patience and persistence can accomplish what force and haste cannot. These conversations remind me that Harold's legacy extends beyond the single case he solved. It's about the example he set and the lessons his story teaches about duty, honor, and the long arc of justice. Tommy came home from college our Thanksgiving and spent hours examining Harold's aircraft and reading through his documentation. My grandson has inherited his great-grandmother's ability to see past surface appearances to underlying truths, and he immediately grasped the significance of what Harold had accomplished and what it meant that he'd chosen me to complete his work. Tommy's respect for Harold's mission and for my role in seeing it through meant more than any official recognition or financial reward. The hangar has become more than a workshop. It's become a memorial to Harold's dedication and a reminder that important work often happens in places and ways that don't attract attention or recognition. The tools Harold left behind are still arranged with military precision, still maintained to professional standards, still ready for whatever tasks might require their use. Working with them connects me to Harold's sense of purpose and reminds me that some responsibilities transcend the individuals who initially accept them. Rex continues to be my constant companion in these endeavors, his presence a bridge between my old life as a small-town mechanic and my new role as guardian of Harold's legacy. He's developed a proprietary attitude toward the hangar, greeting visitors with the kind of alert attention that suggests he understands his importance in this story. When children visit with their school groups, he becomes gentle and patient, allowing them to pet him while I explain how a dog's instincts had led to the discovery that changed everything. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Rex hadn't drawn my attention to that irregular section of concrete, if Harold's evidence had remained buried and his mission had died with him. The thought makes me grateful for the animal instincts that complement human reasoning, for the partnership between man and dog that has served humanity for thousands of years in ways we probably don't fully appreciate or understand. The legal proceedings against Thornton and his associates took nearly 2 years to complete, involving multiple jurisdictions and complex questions about statutes of limitations for federal crimes. Harold's documentation provided the foundation for every prosecution, his careful records serving as evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. When the final verdicts were announced, I felt Harold's presence in the courtroom, his satisfaction at seeing justice finally served after decades of patient investigation. The media attention that followed the arrests and trials briefly made me something of a local celebrity, with reporters wanting to interview the mechanic who'd inherited a federal case and seen it through to successful conclusion. I tried to deflect attention from myself to Harold's story, emphasizing his dedication and expertise rather than my own role in completing his work. But the attention was flattering in its way, recognition that I'd done something worthwhile with an unexpected opportunity. Most importantly, the experience taught me that retirement doesn't have to mean withdrawal from meaningful work or abandonment of purpose. Harold had found a way to continue serving his country long after his official duty had ended, using his skills and knowledge to address injustices that might otherwise have gone uncorrected. His example suggests that the end of a career can be the beginning of a mission, that age and experience can be assets rather than limitations when applied to causes that matter. The hangar now serves multiple purposes: workshop, museum, classroom, and memorial, to a man who understood that some duties extend beyond the boundaries of official service. Local veterans organizations sometimes hold meetings there, finding appropriate symbolism in gathering at a place dedicated to honoring military service and sacrifice. The aircraft Harold left behind serve as tangible reminders of the history these men and women helped create and preserve. On quiet afternoons, when the light slants through the skylights and catches the dust motes dancing in the air, I sometimes imagine I can sense Harold's approval of what his hangar has become. The space that was once his secret workshop is now a community resource, a place where important stories get told and valuable lessons get learned. The transformation seems fitting for a man who'd spent his life serving purposes larger than himself. Rex is getting older, moving more slowly but maintaining the alert intelligence that first drew my attention to Harold's hidden cache. He still takes his position seriously, still guards the hangar with the dedication of a soldier on important duty. When his time comes, I plan to bury him somewhere on the property, in a spot where the afternoon sun creates that warm patch he's claimed as his own. Harold would understand the appropriateness of honoring a faithful companion who'd played such a crucial role in completing his mission. The experience has changed my relationship with inheritance and legacy, teaching me that the most valuable gifts aren't always the ones with the highest monetary value. Harold's bequest wasn't valuable because of the real estate or the aircraft. It was valuable because it came with purpose, responsibility, and the opportunity to make a difference in ways I'd never imagined possible. The trust he'd placed in me had been worth more than any financial windfall. Looking back on the whole experience, I'm struck by how much of life operates on assumptions that turn out to be wrong, how often we dismiss people and situations without understanding their true nature or significance. Harold's story reminds me to look more carefully, listen more attentively, and reserve judgment until I have enough information to make fair assessments. The quiet man everyone thought they knew had been conducting a decades-long investigation that required skills, dedication, and resources none of us had suspected he possessed. Have you ever inherited something that seemed worthless at first, only to discover it carried more value than you could have imagined? Have you ever been trusted with someone else's unfinished business, their final wish, or their unspoken burden, and found yourself transformed by the responsibility of seeing it through to completion? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew had depths and purposes that completely redefined your understanding of who they were and what they devoted their life to accomplishing? I'd like to hear your story because I've learned that these moments of unexpected inheritance, these times when we're called to step into someone else's shoes and complete their unfinished work, are when we discover what we're really made of and what we're truly capable of achieving. They're the moments when ordinary people get the chance to do extraordinary things, when the bonds between strangers prove stronger than the assumptions that divide us, and when the true measure of character gets tested by circumstances we never could have anticipated or prepared for in advance.